What happens when the galaxy's most advanced warriors land in a private jet hangar during a double-shift maintenance cycle? Superior alien technology is useless when a frustrated mechanic decides to use a thermal vent as a target. Before this night was over, a squad of interstellar invaders would be dismantled by the very tools used to fix luxury jets, and not one of them saw it coming. If you love stories where humanity turns out to be the last thing any alien empire wants to mess with, hit that like button right now. And if you are new here, go ahead and subscribe. Because this channel is full of stories exactly like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me where you would want aliens to make their worst mistake. A grocery store, a gym, a hangar full of tired mechanics who just want to go home. Speaking of tired mechanics, that is exactly where we are headed. 12 men, one very long night, and a spaceship full of warriors who picked the wrong building to land in. Now let's move forward on this journey, because what happens next is going to change the way you think about who really runs this planet. 300 light-years away, on a world most people will never hear the real name of, a council of gray-skinned tacticians looked at a glowing star map and pointed at one small, unremarkable blue planet. They called it Designation 7. We call it home. The Kathrax Empire did not get to be one of the most feared powers in known space by being careless. Their scout ships were sleek, matte black wedges with hulls that bent light around them, and their kinetic shields could shrug off a direct hit from a plasma cannon without so much as a flicker. Their doctrine was simple. Identify a target with valuable technology, drop in during the quietest hour, secure the site, and extract before any real resistance could organize. It had worked on 11 other worlds. 11. Their long-range scanners picked up an enormous structure near a mid-sized American airport, thermal signatures glowing steady through the night. Metal alloys that pinged as advanced aerospace grade. Multiple aircraft parked in neat rows, engines idle, hulls gleaming under artificial light. To a fleet analyst 300 light-years away, staring at data on a console, this looked exactly like what they wanted. A private aviation hangar, high-value infrastructure. Minimal expected defense. What the Kathrax scanners could not tell them, because their instruments were not built to measure something so wonderfully irrational, was that this particular hangar ran a 24-hour maintenance operation for corporate jets. It was staffed at that very moment by a crew of tired, coffee-fueled aircraft mechanics who had been on shift since 6 that morning, and were now closing in on hour 18 with no end in sight. Commander Vekar Thras, the Vanguard's ranking officer, studied the readout with the calm satisfaction of a predator that has never once been surprised. His scout ship's onboard intelligence flagged the location as low resistance probability, Category 1. He gave the order. 3 shuttle pods detached from the mothership in low orbit, sliding silently through the atmosphere, cloaked from radar. Guided by thermal mapping software that had never once accounted for the specific heat signature of a running diesel generator, a space heater, and a coffee pot that had been left on since noon. The Kathrax had conquered worlds with far more advanced weaponry than anything humanity had ever built. They had watched empires with orbital defense grids crumble in a matter of hours. Their armor could deflect small arms fire. Their exoskeletal suits amplified strength to nearly 6 times a human's. On paper, on any battlefield in the galaxy, this was not even a contest. But paper does not account for a man named Danny Coleman, who had just dropped a socket wrench for the 3rd time that hour, and was in exactly the kind of mood that makes a person dangerous. The shuttle pods touched down just outside the hangar's rear loading doors at 2 in the morning, their landing gear silent, their presence completely undetected by any conventional radar. 4 Kathrax soldiers stepped out first, their armored boots clicking against the tarmac, scanning for resistance that, according to every calculation their commander had run, simply should not exist. Inside the hangar, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, 12 men were elbow-deep in an engine cowling, half of them running on their 4th cup of coffee. None of them aware that history was about to happen in their workplace. The hangar bay doors, massive sliding panels built to withstand hurricane-force winds and keep multi-million-dollar aircraft safe from the elements, began to hum as the building's automated security system detected an unregistered thermal signature outside. The doors started closing. Nobody inside the hangar had touched a single control. And outside, Commander Vekar Thras watched his tactical display flicker for just a moment, a strange, unfamiliar warning icon blinking in the corner of his visor. He dismissed it as a sensor glitch. It was the first mistake of many, and it would not be his last chance to regret underestimating this particular blue planet. Danny Coleman had been a maintenance mechanic for 19 years, and if there was one thing 19 years of late nights had taught him, it was that exhaustion does something strange to the human brain. It does not always make a man scared. Sometimes it makes him mean. At 2 in the morning on the 18th hour of a shift that was supposed to end at 11, Danny was not thinking about aliens. He was thinking about the stubborn bolt on cowling panel 4, the one that had been cross-threaded by whoever worked the last shift, and the fact that his back had not stopped aching since noon. Around him, the rest of the crew moved with the slow, mechanical rhythm of men who had long since stopped feeling their feet. Ray Thompson was running a diagnostic on a hydraulic line. Mike Sullivan was elbow-deep in a landing gear assembly, muttering to himself about a part that should have arrived 3 days ago. Frank Delgado was on his back under the belly of a Gulfstream, using a flashlight clenched between his teeth. That was when the hangar bay doors began to move on their own. The sound was unmistakable, a deep mechanical groan followed by the whir of the heavy motor system kicking into gear, and every man in that hangar froze at once. Ray was the first to speak. Anybody touched the door controls? Nobody had. The massive doors, each one weighing several tons, slid shut with a heavy metallic clang that echoed through the entire building, sealing the hangar tight. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, and then a low hum started to rise from somewhere near the loading bay, a sound none of them had ever heard before. It was not the hum of any machine in that building. It had a strange, almost organic pulse to it, rising and falling like breathing. Frank rolled out from under the jet, wiping grease off his hands, squinting toward the source of the noise. "That the generator. Generator doesn't sound like that," Mike said, already reaching for the tire iron leaning against his toolbox. A habit born less from fear and more from 19 years of instinct that told him something was wrong. Then the shapes appeared near the loading dock. 4 figures, tall and lean, moving with an unnatural, gliding smoothness, their bodies covered in matte gray armor that seemed to swallow the light around it. Their faces, if you could call them that, were narrow and angular, with wide black eyes that reflected the overhead fluorescence like a cat caught in headlights. For one long moment, nobody in that hangar said a word. Danny Coleman, standing closest to the group, lowered the wrench he had been holding, looked at the strange armored figures approaching across his workplace floor, and said the only thing that felt right in the moment. "You've got to be kidding me." What happened next surprised everyone, including the Kthrax themselves. There was no scream, no panic. No mad scramble for an exit that, thanks to the automated lockdown, did not exist anyway. Instead, 12 exhausted men looked at each other with the shared, silent understanding of people who had already survived worse nights than this. A hydraulic leak at midnight. A landing gear collapse during inspection. A client screaming about a delayed flight while 3 mechanics tried to explain a cracked turbine blade. This was simply the newest problem to solve, and every one of them had spent their entire careers solving problems under pressure with whatever was on hand. Ray Thompson, still holding his diagnostic tablet, was the first to say what everyone else was thinking. Whatever these things are, they walked into a locked building full of angry, tired guys holding power tools. "That's on them." The Kthrax soldiers advanced slowly, their weapons drawn but not yet fired, their sensors clearly struggling to interpret the readings coming off this strange environment. Metal shelving stacked with tools, barrels of hydraulic fluid, a massive hydraulic press sitting quiet in the corner. None of it registered as a weapon on their scanners because none of it was designed to be one. That was about to change. Danny Coleman set his coffee cup down on the workbench, cracked his knuckles, and looked toward the nearest shelf, where a pressure sprayer loaded with industrial degreaser sat exactly where he had left it an hour earlier. "All right, boys," he said, his voice steady, almost bored. "Let's finish this shift." The lead Kthrax soldier raised its weapon, aiming directly at Danny's chest, its targeting display locking on with a soft, confident beep. It had no way of knowing that the man in front of it had already decided, somewhere deep in his exhausted, caffeine-soaked brain. That tonight was not the night he was going to let anything ruin his last 2 hours before quitting time. The first shot fired that night did not come from the Kaithrax. Danny grabbed the pressure sprayer off the shelf in one smooth motion, years of muscle memory taking over, and squeezed the trigger before the lead soldier could finish processing the fact that a human had moved. A thick stream of industrial degreaser, the kind used to strip decades of grime and hydraulic fluid off aircraft engines, hit the soldier square across its visor. For a creature whose entire combat doctrine relied on kinetic shields designed to stop bullets and energy blasts, a slow-moving stream of high-viscosity liquid was not something its systems had ever been asked to defend against. The shield flared uselessly around the impact, its sensors registering the spray as harmless environmental debris rather than an attack, and the degreaser coated the soldier's visor completely, blinding it instantly. The Kaithrax soldier stumbled backward, clawing at its own faceplate, disoriented in a way its training had never prepared it for. Its comrades, watching this happen, hesitated for just a moment too long. That moment was all Mike Sullivan needed. Mike had spent the better part of 2 decades working with pneumatic tools, and there was one thing every mechanic on that floor understood instinctively. A torque wrench designed to remove aircraft bolts under massive pressure does not care what kind of exoskeleton it hits. He swung his pneumatic wrench in a wide arc, the tool's motor screaming to life, and connected with the arm plating of the second soldier as it tried to bring its weapon up. The impact staggered the alien, its armor denting under a force it had clearly never been designed to withstand. Because nothing in the Kaithrax military ever expected to be struck by a tool built to snap bolts, torqued to 500 foot-pounds. Ray Thompson, meanwhile, had made his way toward the massive hydraulic press sitting quiet in the corner of the hangar, the one normally used to reshape stubborn metal panels during heavy maintenance work. 50 tons of slow, patient, unstoppable force. He hit the activation switch just as the third soldier, confused by the chaos unfolding in front of it, backed directly into position beneath the descending press arm. The Kaithrax command pod's alloy plating was rated to withstand small arms fire from most conventional weapons found across a dozen conquered worlds. It was never rated to withstand 50 tons of slow, grinding, mechanical pressure applied directly and with absolutely no mercy. Frank Delgado, still holding his flashlight in one hand, grabbed a socket extension bar in the other and joined Mike in pushing back against the 2 remaining soldiers still capable of fighting. Using the extension bar like a makeshift staff, striking joints in the alien armor that clearly had never been stress-tested against a very determined, very tired man with 19 years of frustration behind every swing. What none of the Kaithrax understood, and what their tactical AI had never once accounted for in any simulation run across 100 successful invasions, was a variable their scientists had simply never bothered to measure. Human spite, the particular, focused fury of a person who has been awake for 18 hours, has 3 more engines to inspect before sunrise, and now has to deal with an alien invasion on top of everything else. Commander Vekar Thras, watching from the rear of the formation, finally raised his own weapon and fired a warning shot into the ceiling, hoping to restore order among his stunned soldiers. Sparks rained down from a shattered light fixture, and for the first time that night, Danny Coleman actually smiled. "You just made this personal," he said, reaching for the largest tool within arm's reach, a full-size breaker bar meant for loosening landing gear bolts that had been rusted in place for years. The degreaser-blinded soldier, still stumbling and disoriented, backed directly into an open thermal exhaust vent near the hangar's rear wall. The same vent normally used to ventilate heat from engine testing procedures. Nobody had planned this. It simply happened the way accidents happen in busy workplaces at the exact worst possible moment for the Kaithrax vanguard. Commander Vekar Thras's tactical display began flashing red, an error message his translation software struggled to properly interpret. Something along the lines of critical propulsion instability detected in Unit 4. He had no idea, not yet, just how catastrophically wrong this entire operation was about to go. The Cathrax Empire's sensor arrays were, by galactic standards, extraordinary. They could track energy signatures across vast distances, detect cloaked ships from millions of miles away, and predict enemy troop movements based on subtle shifts in electromagnetic fields. What they could not do, as it turned out, was reliably track a rusted pipe wrench swinging through the air with absolutely no electronic signature whatsoever. Ray Thompson had picked up the wrench without even thinking about it, grabbing whatever was closest as the second wave of confusion swept through the Cathrax formation. He watched the blinded soldier stumble backward toward the thermal vent, watched its arms flail as it tried to regain its balance, and made a split-second decision that would end up being told and retold for the rest of his career. He threw the wrench. It struck the soldier's exposed shoulder joint at the exact moment the alien's back foot crossed into the exhaust vent's active airflow. And the combination of the impact and the sudden loss of balance sent the soldier sprawling directly into the vent's intake grate. What followed was not something any of the 12 men in that hangar had planned or could have predicted, but it turned out that Cathrax armor, for all its advanced engineering, was never designed to handle direct exposure to superheated exhaust gas from a jet engine testing cycle that had, coincidentally, been running a scheduled diagnostic just 20 minutes earlier. The soldier's suit systems overloaded instantly. Warning lights across its armor flared bright orange, then red, and then the entire propulsion pack strapped to its back. The very same pack that gave Cathrax soldiers their enhanced strength and mobility began venting uncontrolled energy in violent, sputtering bursts. Commander Vekar Thras watched his soldier collapse in a shower of sparks and felt something he had not felt in over a decade of successful campaigns. Genuine, cold uncertainty. His tactical AI, the same system that had flagged this location as Low Resistance Probability Category 1, was now struggling to process an entirely new classification of threat. Non-electronic. Gravity-fed, completely unpredictable. The AI had no framework for understanding a species that fought back with degreaser sprays, hydraulic presses, and thrown hand tools. Because nothing in its extensive combat database had ever needed to. Mike Sullivan pressed his advantage, swinging his pneumatic wrench again and again against the second soldier's weakened arm plating, until the joint finally gave way with a metallic crunch. The alien's weapon clattering uselessly to the concrete floor. Frank Delgado tackled the third soldier bodily, using every bit of the wrestling skills he had picked up in high school 2 decades earlier. Pinning the creature's arms long enough for Danny Coleman to bring the breaker bar down across its helmet with a force that would have snapped a human collarbone. By now, the once confident Cathrax vanguard was in complete disarray. Their kinetic shields, calibrated for energy weapons and standard projectiles, had done absolutely nothing to stop degreaser, pneumatic tools, or 50 tons of slow-moving hydraulic pressure. Their thermal cloaking, designed to hide them from orbital scanners, meant nothing inside a building lit by fluorescent tubes and staffed by men who could simply see them with their own 2 eyes. Commander Vekar Thras made the only decision left available to him. He activated his personal shield generator, drew his sidearm, and charged directly at the nearest human. Determined to at least salvage some measure of dignity from what was quickly becoming the worst night of his military career. That human happened to be Danny Coleman, who was still holding the breaker bar, breathing hard, sweat mixing with grease on his forehead, and very much not in the mood to lose to anyone. Alien or otherwise, after 18 straight hours on his feet. "Come on then," Danny muttered, planting his feet. The commander closed the distance fast, faster than any human could reasonably react to, his shield generator humming at full power, his sidearm charged and ready to fire. For one terrifying second, it looked like the tide of this fight was finally about to turn back in the Vanguard's favor. And then Ray Thompson, still holding onto that same instinct that had guided him through 19 years of aircraft maintenance emergencies, threw the hangar's master breaker switch, plunging half the building into darkness and sending an electromagnetic pulse through every powered tool and outlet in that section of the hangar. The commander's shield generator, drawing power from the same frequency range that Pulse disrupted, sputtered, and died. For one full second, the hangar was almost silent, lit only by the flickering emergency lights along the far wall, and the faint orange glow still coming from the disabled soldier near the exhaust vent. Commander Vekar Thras stood frozen, his shield generator dead, his sidearm's targeting display blinking uselessly, staring at a man holding a breaker bar who did not look even slightly impressed by an interstellar warrior's fury. Danny Coleman swung first. The breaker bar connected with the commander's forearm just as he tried to raise his weapon, knocking the sidearm clean out of his grip and sending it skidding across the concrete floor, where it disappeared under a nearby toolbox. Vekar Thras, trained in hand-to-hand combat techniques developed over centuries of successful campaigns across a dozen conquered worlds, lunged forward anyway, trusting his enhanced strength to finish what his weapons no longer could. What he did not account for was Frank Delgado tackling him from the side at full speed, using the exact same technique that had once pinned a 230-pound wrestler to a mat back in his senior year of high school. The commander went down hard, his armor scraping against the concrete, and before he could recover, Mike Sullivan was standing over him with the pneumatic wrench raised, its motor whining ready. "Stay down," Mike said simply, and for whatever reason, in whatever language the commander's translation implant processed those words, the message came through loud and clear. Meanwhile, near the rear of the hangar, the remaining Kaithrax soldier, the one still trapped beneath the massive hydraulic press activated earlier by Ray Thompson, had finally stopped struggling. Its armor, dented and cracked from the slow, relentless pressure, had failed catastrophically at the joints, and its onboard systems flashed a final warning that scrolled across its dying display in a language none of the mechanics in that hangar could read, though the general meaning was not exactly hard to guess. The soldier near the thermal vent, the one whose propulsion pack had overloaded earlier, finally gave out completely in a burst of sparks and hissing steam, its systems shutting down entirely, leaving it slumped against the exhaust grate in a position that would later require 2 men and a forklift to move. Commander Vekar Thras, pinned beneath Frank's weight with Mike's wrench hovering inches from his helmet, made one final attempt at diplomacy, his translation implant crackling to life with a garbled, static-filled message. This designation was flagged as low resistance. Danny Coleman knelt down next to him, breathing hard, grease and sweat streaking his face, and allowed himself a tired, satisfied laugh. "Buddy, you picked the one building in this entire county where everybody's already having the worst night of their life. You just made it worse for both of us." Outside, in low orbit, the Kaithrax mothership sensors registered the sudden and complete loss of contact with all 3 shuttle pods simultaneously. No distress signal, no tactical data. Just silence, the kind of silence that, in over 100 successful invasions across a dozen worlds, the Kaithrax Empire had never once experienced from a supposedly undefended target. The remaining fleet officers aboard that ship stared at their consoles in stunned confusion, running diagnostic after diagnostic, trying to understand how an entire Vanguard squad, equipped with the finest technology their empire had ever produced, could simply vanish without a single recorded casualty on the enemy side. Back inside the hangar, the 12 mechanics stood among the wreckage of alien armor, tangled propulsion packs, and one very embarrassed enemy commander, and did the only thing that made sense to men who still had 2 hours left on their shift. They got back to work, dragging the fallen soldiers off to the side so they wouldn't trip over them, because whatever had just happened. Cowling Panel 4 still needed that stubborn bolt removed before sunrise. By the time the sun came up over the airport, the hangar looked less like a battlefield, and more like a strange, slightly chaotic cleanup job that nobody had signed up for. The airport's private security team arrived first, followed shortly by a group of very serious men in plain suits who never gave a straight answer about who exactly they worked for, but who clearly knew a great deal more about Kaithrax armor plating than any government agency should have reasonably known. Commander Vekar Thras, still restrained with a length of chain normally used to secure loose cargo during transport, sat quietly against the hangar wall. watching as his fallen soldiers' equipment was carefully catalogued, photographed, and loaded onto unmarked trucks. His translation implant occasionally crackled with what sounded suspiciously like disbelief. Repeating the phrase, low resistance probability, under his breath, as if saying it enough times might somehow change the outcome of the previous night. Danny Coleman, Ray Thompson, Mike Sullivan, and Frank Delgado were pulled aside separately by the men in suits, asked a series of careful questions about exactly what had happened, and given a firm but polite reminder that none of this would ever appear on the evening news. In exchange, they were told, quietly, that their little maintenance hangar would be receiving a substantial and completely unexplainable grant for facility upgrades sometime in the next fiscal year. Nobody complained. The official cleanup report, filed weeks later and buried deep within a classification system most people will never know exists, noted with a strange kind of clinical understatement that recovered alien alloy components had been repurposed, following standard salvage procedure, into replacement parts for 2 corporate aircraft undergoing scheduled maintenance. In a very literal sense, the K-Thrax Vanguard's advanced technology ended up keeping a Gulfstream's landing gear running smoothly for the next several years, which is either the most fitting punishment or the strangest coincidence in the entire history of interstellar warfare. 300 light-years away, K-Thrax Central Command received the salvaged black box data from the mothership months later, delivered through channels that remain, even now, a closely guarded secret. The report that followed sent a quiet wave of concern through the Empire's highest military circles. Designation 7, the small blue planet once flagged as a soft, undefended target, was formally reclassified as a non-viable invasion zone, citing what the report generously described as unpredictable civilian aggression levels exceeding acceptable operational risk thresholds. In simpler terms, the greatest empire in known space looked at what 12 exhausted mechanics did with degreaser, pneumatic tools, and a hydraulic press, and decided it was simply not worth finding out what an entire planet full of sleep-deprived humans with deadlines might be capable of. Danny Coleman finished his shift that morning like he had finished 1,000 shifts before it, clocking out at exactly 6 in the morning. Driving home with the radio playing something he barely registered, and falling asleep the moment his head hit the pillow. When he woke up that afternoon, he genuinely wondered, for just a moment, if the entire night had been some kind of exhaustion-fueled hallucination. Then he noticed the strange, faint burn mark on his workbench that no amount of scrubbing ever fully removed, and he figured some things were better left unexplained. Ray Thompson kept a small, unassuming piece of gray alloy plating in his toolbox for years afterward, telling curious coworkers only that it was a souvenir from a rough shift, and leaving it at that. Mike Sullivan eventually got promoted to shift supervisor, a role he approached with the same quiet, unshakable confidence he had shown while swinging a pneumatic wrench at an alien invader. Frank Delgado, for his part, never did explain to his wife why he suddenly developed such a strong interest in aircraft self-defense training, though she stopped asking questions once she noticed how much better he slept afterward. As for Commander Vekar Thras, wherever the men in suits eventually took him, the last thing he reportedly said, translated imperfectly through a damaged implant, was a simple and rather philosophical observation. Something about how an empire that had conquered a dozen worlds through overwhelming technological superiority had ultimately been undone by 12 tired men who simply refused to have a bad night. Made worse, and somewhere out among the stars, in classrooms and training simulations across the K-Thrax Empire, a new case study was quietly added to the curriculum. One that future commanders would study for generations to come, right alongside the golden rule that every young cadet would soon learn by heart. Never, under any circumstances, interrupt a sleep-deprived human with a deadline. If this story kept you hooked until the very end, let me know in the comments what tool you think would make the best weapon against an alien invasion. Share this video with someone who needs a good laugh today, and subscribe if you want more stories exactly like this one, because there are a lot more humans out there about to have the worst night of some alien's life. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.